I'm being bombarded by outraged druids. It's not the equinox, it's the summer solstice. But it's holy, I think, to them, and that's why I was generous enough to mention it. Now, Biden and Blinken. Not since Laurel and Hardy has there been a double act like it. Which one's Laurel? Which one's Hardy? You take your pick. Blinken begged the Chinese to be allowed to visit Beijing. They had not even picked up his phone calls or the phone calls of any other senior officials of the Biden administration because of the bogus hullabaloo about an off-course weather balloon. You remember it? It was turned into one of the great triumphs of the American Top Guns, you remember? So the Chinese were extremely offended about it. Blinken had to beg for a meeting. He finally got one. And then he had to beg at that meeting for a meeting with the big man, the top man, not Joe Biden, but the president of China, Xi Jinping. He had to beg quite hard because Xi Jinping was not that pleased to see him, judging by the body language when the two of them met, which saw Blinken bowing, you might call it, kowtowing, whilst a very, very diffident Xi Jinping stood very frostily, extending his hand just a little so that the two could shake. Anyway, the talks apparently went quite well. And by all accounts, some significant issues, not least of communication between these two biggest economies in the world, these two superpowers, and of course, two countries where the danger of World War III lurks underneath the waves, on top of the waves, in the air, waves everywhere. It seemed like it was a success. But no sooner had Blinken got back to the United States. In fact, I'm reliably told he hadn't even unpacked his suitcase when Joe Biden burst his balloon, burst his bubble, blew it all up like the Top Gun he is, with a ritual, fatuous barrage of insults, as is his wont. I've no doubt that they had let him off the leash and they had no idea what he was going to say. Hey, Joe Biden doesn't have any idea what he's going to say. But the insults that he issued against the Chinese leader have returned everything to the square go that they started on. They're getting their shapes up again. They're going toe to toe again. And what looked like the possibility of a lessening of tension has dramatically increased that tension back, at least to where it was before Blinken began. Just another day in the Biden White House. Now, everyone's calling Hunter Biden's deal with Joe Biden's Department of Justice that he secretly met, and I have no doubt that Hunter Biden's deal was one of the issues that he was discussing with the DOJ officials sitting on steps outside the Oval Office that were captured and released by photographers. Joe Biden's DOJ has not given Hunter Biden a sweetheart deal. The fact that he's been allowed to plead on 2 minor income tax charges and a technical infraction of America's gun laws means that he will not go to jail. So everything else that was on his laptop has not warranted even a charge. And the punishment, such as it will be, turns out to be the sweetheart deal of all sweetheart deals. A Valentine's Day kissing of his ring. That's the only way you could describe it. Because he's not even going to be tagged. He's not going to spend an hour behind bars, even though people who have faced exactly the same charges, got years in prison for it. Even though a grandmother in her late 60s is serving 3 years in jail for wandering around with or without a moose hat on her head in the January 6th incident. She got 3 years in jail. Hunter Biden gets no jail for cheating the IRS and swaggering around naked in front of very young girls with a pistol that he should not have been in possession of. Now you tell me if this is increasingly looking like a banana republic, and I defy you to deny it. Tucker Carlson has been going great guns on this, and he summed it up in the title, I think, of his latest broadcast, that it is much safer to be the president's son in America than it is to be his main presidential opponent. They're sending his main presidential opponent to prison for offenses, if offenses they be, that Joe Biden himself is demonstrably guilty of, and over a much longer period of time, and over far more documents, and having stored them far less securely. Trump's were in a locked room at Mar-a-Lago. Biden's are in plastic bags parked behind his pretty little green Corvette in his garage, or rather Hunter Biden's garage. Because as you'll recall, I told you about 12 months ago or so, this little Corvette is parked outside the most expensive property in history in the state of Delaware. The landlord is Joe Biden. The tenant is Hunter Biden. He's paying a king's ransom to his father in rent. Where's he getting the money from? Well, his laptop gives some clue to that. There was a never-ending stream of foreign payments going into Hunter Biden's bank account, and according to Congressman Grassley in the American House of Representatives, they are now in possession of evidence that shows that not just Hunter Biden as a conduit, some of it being kicked back to the big guy, but Joe Biden, who may or may not be the big guy, directly receiving 2 payments of tens of millions of dollars, which at the time were not reported to the IRS, have now mysteriously appeared in his tax returns for, I think, 2018. A sum has appeared there of $10 million to the Vice President of the United States. The Vice President of the United States had a payment in of $10 million while in office. But there's no record at all of who paid him this sum and for what services. Now, call me Sherlock Holmes if you like, but I have worked out that Joe Biden, through his son, through his brother, and other friends and relations, was touting his influence all over the world for big bucks, which must be a crime somewhere along the road, isn't it? Maybe even a minor crime that you could plead to, maybe even get that famous slap on the wrist for, but no. His Justice Department is the most corrupt Justice Department in the long history of corruption in the United States of America. And Joe Biden is the most corrupt president the United States has ever had. And I include Donald Trump, and I include Richard Nixon, and I include every president they have ever had in their country. Chicago sounds nice, but better not plan an October weekend there, because every weekend, scores of people are being shot in the democratic stronghold of Chicago. I mention it not out of schadenfreude. I love Chicago and feel for its people very much indeed. They have been misruled for decades by the party to which they are unaccountably loyal. I mention it because it's lesson 25,103 in why you should stop looking to a country so dysfunctional that scores of people are murdered in a weekend in one of its cities, which can scarcely recover from a mass school shooting before the next mass school shooting occurs. I wish America would do as Bobby Kennedy is promising to do, would bring its force back into its own country, bring its money back into its own country, and solve its own problems rather than swaggering around the world, dealing out deadly, lethal violence, more lethal than any Saturday night in Chicago, to countries and peoples all over the world. Stop imagining America is your father. Would you like a father like Joe Biden? Not me. Now let me turn to what will be the subject of my discussion with the expert Scott Ritter in just a few minutes. Variously, this counter-offensive, which was to be a spring counter-offensive and then became a summer counter-offensive, only to stop by the solstice, not the equinox, but the solstice this day. Now, President Putin says it has stalled because of massive losses suffered by the Ukrainians. Stoltenberg, the Norwegian tailor who heads NATO, is he a tailor or a tailor's dummy? I never quite remember my own insults. Stoltenberg says it has stalled because of Russian resistance and heavy rain. That's a new one. Heavy rain, Russian resistance. Who would have thunk it when they launched their counter-offensive? This matters because if you care about the poor, bloody infantry of Ukraine, literally being snatched off the streets and press-ganged into the front line without training, without proper organization, a hodgepodge of different regiments, battalions, companies, people they don't even know, they're suddenly in a trench with all of them with different weapons systems received from a myriad of Ukraine's friends, they call themselves, who apparently are unmoved by the massive losses being suffered by the people bearing their weapons that they have pushed and pushed into action. Scott will tell us if it's the rain or if it's the Russian resistance or if it's something else. I have a feeling something else is going on. Budanov, the head of intelligence, has disappeared now for weeks. Although a picture, or a Photoshop rather, of him with some Ukrainian biggins was issued earlier. I must say it was one of the worst Photoshops I have ever seen. If that was Budanov, I am a Dutchman. It looked like a cardboard cutout or a bloated balloon-like figure that a child would draw and then a picture of the man stuck on top of it. The head of the armed forces, Zaluzny, has also disappeared for the last few weeks. He's not in any of the calls with their allies. He's not at any of the cabinet gatherings, pictures of which are regularly released. So how come Ukraine's armed forces, in the middle of a counter-offensive, seem to lack a head of intelligence and the head of the army? I was already getting suspicious. And then I saw Mr. Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, today. Now, Klitschko packed a proper punch when he was in the ring. I liked him as a boxer. I've no idea what he's like as a mayor, but I can tell you he is very angry indeed. And he took to social media today, in the middle of a counter-offensive, to tell us about the fighting that's going on, not at the front, but in Kiev, amongst the political leaders. And that got me thinking that this stalling or lulling of the spring, now summer, counter-offensive may very well be linked to potentially decisive political maneuvers in the dark that are going on in the subterranean world of Zelensky and his political gang. I'm sure that Scott will tell us plenty about that. So, fasten your seatbelts. It is going to be a bumpy night. You can vote on our poll, by the way, which seems to have confused some people. Who is more likely to see jail time, Donald Trump or Hunter Biden? Some of you are voting with your hearts. Some of you are voting with your heads. Some of you are voting for the one they want to see in jail. Others are voting with the one they think is more likely to end up in jail. Me, I'm voting Donald Trump, not because I necessarily think he will end up in jail, but because I'm certain that Hunter Biden will not. This is the mother of all talk shows. Stay tuned for the next 1 hour and 40 minutes. It's going to be the mother of all talk shows.